In the packed courtroom, the millionaire's mistress kicks his pregnant wife's stomach in front of everyone, a brutal act that freezes the entire room. What no one knew is that the judge who rises in fury is the victim's father. From that moment on, justice is no longer just a duty, it becomes personal. If you love stories like this, watch till the end, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment letting us know where you're listening from. The August humidity in Chicago made the air conditioning in the Cook County Courthouse feel almost useless. Courtroom 7, with its dark, wood-paneled walls and the Great Seal of the United States hanging behind the judge's chair, was steeped in a tense silence that seemed to vibrate with electricity. On the left, occupying a cushioned chair as if it were a throne, was Richard "Rick" Sterling, a real estate mogul known for erecting the most luxurious skyscrapers in the Windy City. His Italian designer navy blue suit was impeccable, the Swiss watch on his wrist gleamed, and his dark eyes scanned the room with the indifference of a man accustomed to getting everything he wanted. Beside him, chewing gum with a casualness that bordered on disrespect, was Amber Thorne, a woman with platinum blonde hair and nails painted a shade of red that were far too long, wearing a wine-colored outfit that completely clashed with the sobriety the environment demanded. She kept a possessive hand on Rick's arm, casting provocative and disdainful glances at the other side of the room. On the right, huddled in a simple chair, was Clara Miller. 8 months pregnant, she wore a light blue dress that could barely accommodate her voluminous belly. Her once beautiful face was marked by deep, dark circles and puffiness around her eyes, evidence of entire nights spent awake, crying over her situation. Her hands trembled slightly as they rested on her womb in an instinctive gesture of protection. Beside her, Alan Fisher, a dedicated but visibly overwhelmed public defender, nervously organized a stack of documents. He knew he was facing an uphill battle. On the other side was Marcus Quinn, a renowned attorney from a firm in the Loop, specializing in defending wealthy businessmen in divorce proceedings. The genuine leather briefcase on his table seemed to weigh a ton, filled with legal strategies ready to crush any resistance. Clara watched it all as if she were in a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. 3 years earlier, she was just a recent architecture graduate from Northwestern University, full of dreams and projects. She met Rick at a corporate event, where she was presenting a project on sustainable urban development. He was fascinated not only by her understated beauty, but by her sharp intelligence and the passion with which she spoke about transforming the city. Their courtship was a whirlwind of dinners at expensive restaurants, trips to the coast, and promises of a brilliant future together. The wedding took place in a lavish ceremony at the historic Fourth Presbyterian Church on Michigan Avenue, with hundreds of guests and a reception that made local news. Clara believed she had found the love of her life. The first few months were of genuine happiness. Rick encouraged her professionally, introduced her to his influential contacts, and seemed proud to have her by his side. But slowly, subtly, things began to change. He started making comments about her clothes, suggesting she dress more elegantly to match the standards of Chicago's high society. He began to question her about every friend, every outing, every minute she spent away from home. His business trips became more frequent and longer. When Clara discovered she was pregnant, she believed it could reconnect them, bring back the man she had fallen in love with. Rick smiled when she told him the news, but it was a cold, mechanical smile, like someone receiving routine information in a business meeting. 2 months later, Clara discovered the truth in the most brutal way. Coming home early from a doctor's appointment, she found Amber in her own house, wearing a robe she herself had given Rick for Christmas. The argument was devastating. Rick didn't deny it, didn't apologize. He just said, with a coldness that chilled Clara to the bone, that she had become boring, predictable, and that Amber brought back the excitement he needed. Amber, for her part, laughed in Clara's face, saying that pregnant women lost all their charm, and that she should be grateful Rick was even keeping the marriage on paper. That same week, Clara was kicked out of their Gold Coast mansion. Rick kept everything, all the assets, all their joint savings. She moved back to a small rental in Lakeview, depending on the help of friends and the assistance of the public. Defender to avoid being completely destitute. Now, sitting in that courtroom, Clara felt the weight of humiliation and injustice. Rick had not only cheated on her and abandoned her while pregnant, but he was using all his financial power and influence to ensure she left the divorce with nothing. He claimed through his lawyer that the child wasn't his, an absurd lie considering they had been married, and the prenatal exams confirmed the timeline of the pregnancy. But Rick didn't care about truths or lies. He only cared about winning, about not having to divide his assets or pay child support. To him, Clara was just another business problem to be solved efficiently and without unnecessary expenses. The side door of the courtroom opened, and the bailiff loudly announced the judge's entrance. Everyone rose immediately, except for Rick, who did so with a demonstrative slowness, almost disdainfully, as if to make it clear that he didn't bow easily to anyone. Judge Henry Miller entered with firm steps and an erect posture. He was a man in his mid-60s, with graying hair combed back, gold-rimmed glasses, and a serious expression that commanded immediate respect. He wore the black robe with a dignity that seemed to emanate from decades of experience in the Illinois judiciary. His eyes, however, were what drew the most attention, piercing, observant, capable of assessing every detail and every lie spoken before him. Judge Miller sat down, adjusted his glasses, and quickly leafed through the file before him. The settlement hearing began with the opening statement from Marcus Quinn, Rick's lawyer. His voice was polished, confident, rehearsed like that of a seasoned actor. He began by painting a completely distorted picture of reality, alleging that Clara suffered from severe emotional disorders, that the pregnancy was a desperate attempt to financially trap a successful man, and that there were serious doubts about the child's paternity. Every word was a stab to Clara's heart, who clutched her hands over her belly, trying to control the tears that threatened to fall. Alan Fisher tried to rebut, presenting medical reports, joint bank statements, wedding photos, and testimonies from friends who confirmed the couple's stable and long-lasting relationship. But his words seemed weak against the well-constructed rhetoric of the opposing counsel. It was then that Rick asked to speak. Judge Miller granted permission, and the mogul stood up with a theatrical pose. In a calm and controlled voice, he began to narrate a completely fabricated version of events. According to him, Clara was an unstable woman who had pursued him from the beginning, who had manipulated the pregnancy to gain access to his money, and that he, moved by compassion, had maintained the marriage until he could no longer endure her emotional crises. He said he wasn't sure about the paternity and refused to take responsibility for a child that might not be his. Clara felt her world collapse. The lies were so blatant, so absurd, that she could hardly believe anyone could utter those words with such tranquility. Amber, next to Rick, was smiling openly, enjoying the show. Judge Miller remained impassive, taking notes, observing every movement, every expression. When Rick finished his statement and sat down again, the judge turned to Clara. In a gentle but firm voice, he asked if she would like to speak. Clara tried, but her voice came out choked and trembling. Tears streamed freely down her face as she tried to explain the truth, but emotion suffocated her. It was at that moment that Amber decided to intervene. Without waiting for permission, she stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. In a shrill, venomous voice, she began to scream at Clara. She called her a gold digger, a liar, a desperate woman trying to ruin a good man's life. The bailiff tried to intervene, calling for order, but Amber was in a trance of arrogance. She walked toward the center of the room, pointing an accusatory finger at Clara, saying she should be ashamed of using a pregnancy as a weapon, that women like her were a disgrace to society. Clara, unable to bear any more humiliation, tried to stand up to leave the room. Her legs were shaking, the weight of her belly making it difficult to move. She just wanted to escape that place, that horrible situation. But Amber, seized by an inexplicable fury, blocked her path. The two women stood face to face, Clara with red, swollen eyes, Amber with a cruel smile on her lips. And then, in a split second that seemed to stretch for an eternity, Amber lifted her leg and delivered a violent kick with the sharp point of her stiletto heel directly into Clara's pregnant stomach. The sound was horrific, a dry thud that echoed through the room like a gunshot. Clara screamed a high-pitched cry of pain and despair, and her hands immediately flew to her womb. She staggered, lost her balance, and fell to her knees on the floor, doubling over as she sobbed uncontrollably. The room erupted into chaos. Alan Fisher rushed to her side, shouting for medical help. The bailiff moved on Amber, who backed away, gesturing frantically and yelling that Clara was faking it, that it was all a show to get the judge's sympathy. Rick remained seated, merely annoyed by the scandal, concerned only with the headlines it might generate, and the image of his mistress being restrained by a court officer. But up on the bench, behind the solemn desk, Judge Henry Miller didn't bang his gavel. He didn't shout for order. He simply stood up, slowly, with absolute control of his movements. His normally serene face was transformed. His eyes blazed with a cold, deadly fury that made even Rick shift uncomfortably in his chair. Completely ignoring protocol, the judge descended the steps from the bench, something that rarely happened, and walked directly to where Clara had fallen. He knelt beside her with a gentleness that completely contrasted with his usual rigid posture, and placed a hand on her shoulder. Clara looked up with tear-filled eyes and saw the judge's face. There was something in those eyes, something she couldn't immediately identify. Concern, fury, and something deeper, more personal. The judge whispered words of comfort, telling her she would be okay, that help was on the way, that nothing bad would happen to her or the baby. His voice was firm, but incredibly kind. Then he turned, still kneeling, and looked directly at Rick and Amber. The look he gave them was a sentence in itself, a silent promise that none of this would go unpunished. Paramedics rushed into the courtroom with a stretcher and medical equipment. Clara was carefully placed on the gurney, still clutching her stomach and crying softly. Judge Miller stayed by her side until the last moment, holding her hand and repeating that everything would be all right. Only when she was wheeled out of the room did he stand up, adjust his robe, and walk back toward the bench. But he didn't ascend. He stood there, at the foot of the steps, staring intently at Rick and Amber. The silence that fell was charged with an almost palpable tension. Rick, realizing the situation was spiraling out of his control, tried to get up and leave. He gestured for Amber to follow him, signaling to Marcus Quinn to also withdraw. But before any of them could take a step toward the door, the judge's voice echoed through the room. It wasn't a shout, it was something worse. It was a low, controlled tone, laden with an absolute authority that froze everyone in place. He ordered the doors to be locked immediately. The bailiff, without a moment's hesitation, turned the key in the main doors and locked and stood guard in front of it. The side door used by judges and court staff was also secured. Rick let out a disbelieving laugh. He turned to the judge with an expression of contempt and began to speak in a loud voice, saying this was absurd, that he had rights, that he couldn't be held against his will. His voice, full of arrogance and indignation, resonated through the empty room. He threatened to sue the court, mentioned the names of judges who were his personal friends, cited influential politicians who attended his dinners and charity events. He said he would end the judge's career, that he would make sure this episode reached the right ears. Amber, having regained her composure after the initial shock of being restrained, joined the chorus of complaints, claiming she had been assaulted, that Clara had provoked everything, that it was an injustice for her to be treated like a criminal. Marcus Quinn, the experienced lawyer, tried a more diplomatic approach. In a calm but firm voice, he asked the judge to reconsider, arguing that locking the doors constituted unlawful restraint and that his clients had the right to leave. He cited articles of the law, mentioned precedents, trying to use legal language as a shield. But Judge Miller didn't move, he didn't respond. He simply looked at Rick with an intensity that made the mogul, despite all his bravado, feel a chill run down his spine. Then, with deliberate and calm movements, the judge ascended the steps to the bench, sat in his chair, and opened a folder that was separate from the main case file. It was a different folder, made of dark brown leather, containing documents that were not officially part of the divorce proceedings. He adjusted his glasses and began to read. It wasn't a routine reading of the case file, it was something entirely different. With a deadly calm, he began to recite, from memory, extremely detailed and precise information about Richard Sterling's financial activities. He mentioned bank accounts in tax havens like the Cayman Islands that not even Rick's own lawyer knew existed. He cited exact numbers of transfers made to offshore corporations, amounts that had been evaded from the IRS over the last 10 years. He described in minute detail schemes of overbilling on public works projects Rick had carried out through contracts with the city of Chicago, mentioning the names of city officials who had received kickbacks in exchange for rigged bids. He revealed investments in real estate developments that used fraudulent documentation to approve construction in environmentally protected areas. Every sentence was a bombshell, every number a conviction. Rick turned pale. His face, once flushed with irritation, became as white as a sheet. His hands began to tremble slightly. Marcus Quinn was also visibly shaken, realizing this was no bluff, that the information was real and extremely compromising. Amber looked from one to the other, not fully understanding the gravity of what was happening, but sensing from Rick's terrified expression that something was very, very wrong. The mogul tried to interrupt, raising his voice to say it was slander, that there was no proof, that they were just empty accusations. But his voice came out weak, unconvincing. Judge Miller simply raised a hand, signaling for silence, and continued. He described how Rick used shell companies to launder money, how he avoided paying taxes through illegal accounting maneuvers, how he bribed city inspectors to approve projects that violated building codes. He mentioned specific dates, exact amounts, names of those involved. It was as if he had investigated every business move Rick had made in recent years with the precision of a prosecutor preparing a criminal indictment. And perhaps that was exactly what was happening. Rick finally understood that he was not facing an ordinary judge. This was not a judge who could be bought, intimidated, or manipulated, and more frighteningly, this was someone who had access to information that not even the IRS or the state's attorney's office seemed to have. His mind raced, trying to figure out how this judge knew all of this, how he had obtained this information, what else he might know. Genuine fear began to set in. This was no longer just about the divorce, about child support or division of assets. This was about his freedom, about the empire he had built with so much effort, even if through questionable means. Then Judge Miller stopped reading the documents. He closed the folder slowly, took off his glasses and placed them on the desk. He looked directly at Rick with an expression that mixed contempt with something deeper, something personal. And in a low voice that thundered through the room, he said something that would completely change the course of the hearing. He pointed to the door where Clara had been taken out on the stretcher and declared that that woman, that victim of a cowardly assault and public humiliation, was not just another abandoned wife seeking justice. She was someone very special, someone he had known since the day she was born. The judge revealed that Clara Miller used her mother's last name. Her mother, Teresa Miller, had been the only woman he had ever truly loved in his youth. They had met in law school at Northwestern in the 70s, when they were both young idealists dreaming of changing the world through justice. They fell deeply in love, planned a future together, but their families were from very different social classes. His family, traditional and influential, did not accept the relationship. They pressured him, threatened to disinherit him, used every resource to separate them. And he, young and cowardly as he confessed at that moment, had given in to family pressure. He left Teresa when she was 3 months pregnant. Teresa never told him about the pregnancy directly. He found out through mutual friends, but by then he was already engaged to another woman, an arranged marriage that would bring social and professional benefits to his family. He tried to find Teresa, offered financial help, but she refused everything. She said she would raise her daughter alone, with dignity, without depending on a man who had abandoned her for social convenience. And so she did. Clara was born and grew up with only her mother's last name. Teresa worked as a literature teacher in public schools, raised her daughter with love and strong principles, and never spoke ill of the father to the girl. She only said that he couldn't be present, but that didn't mean Clara was any less loved. Judge Miller confessed that for all those years, he had followed his daughter's life from a distance. He contributed financially anonymously through scholarships that Teresa believed were based on Clara's academic merit. He ensured she had access to good schools, to prep courses, to the university. He never introduced himself, never claimed paternity, because he respected Teresa's decision and because he knew he didn't deserve the title of father. But he always knew where Clara was, what she was doing, how her life was going. He knew when she graduated with a degree in architecture. He knew when she married Richard Sterling. And he knew when she was abandoned while pregnant. The revelation fell upon the room like an avalanche. Rick, already shaken by the information about his financial fraud, now faced something infinitely worse. He hadn't just humiliated and abandoned a pregnant woman. He had done it to the daughter of one of the most respected and feared judges in Illinois. A judge known for his unshakable integrity, for his severity in sentencing corruption and abuse of power. A man with deep connections in the state and federal judiciary, who was consulted on high-profile cases, whose opinion carried weight in important decisions. Amber, finally grasping the scale of the disaster, let out a low moan and sank into her chair. Marcus Quinn closed his leather briefcase, knowing there was nothing more he could do to defend his clients at that moment. The bailiff stood firm at the door, a silent witness to the bombshell revelation. Rick tried to speak, tried to say something, but no sound came from his mouth. His mind was in an absolute panic, calculating the consequences, trying to find an escape that simply didn't exist. The judge continued, his voice now thick, with restrained emotion. He said that he had failed as a father, that he hadn't been there when Clara needed him, that he hadn't protected her from life's hardships. But at that moment, in that room, he would not fail again. He would not allow an arrogant and corrupt man to destroy the life of his daughter and his grandchild. He would not allow justice to be manipulated by money and influence, and he certainly would not allow a cowardly assault on a pregnant woman to go unpunished. He explained that he had started investigating Rick the moment he learned of Clara's marriage. It was something he did discreetly with any man who got close to his daughter, a silent way of protecting her without her knowledge. And what he had discovered about Richard Sterling was far worse than he had imagined. That was why he had kept that separate folder, that complete dossier on the mogul's illicit activities. He had hoped he would never have to use it, hoped he was wrong about the man's character. But now, seeing his daughter assaulted, humiliated, and threatened before his very eyes, he would not hesitate to use every piece of information in that dossier. Judge Miller turned his attention to Amber Thorne, who was trying to make herself small in her chair, as if she could disappear if she just stayed quiet enough. But there was nowhere to hide. In a firm and relentless voice, he questioned her directly about the assault. He asked if she understood the gravity of what she had done, if she was aware that assaulting a pregnant woman was not just a common act of violence, but something that could have irreversible consequences for an innocent life. Amber tried to defend herself, stammering that Clara had provoked her, that it was an impulse, that she didn't really mean to hurt anyone. But her words sounded empty and pathetic even to her own ears. The judge did not accept her excuses. He explained with the precision of someone who knows the law inside and out, that the act of deliberately kicking a pregnant woman's abdomen constituted not just battery, but endangered the lives of two people, the mother and the baby. It was aggravated battery, with the added factors of cowardice and cruelty. There was no possibility of bail for this type of offense, no deal that could be made. Amber would be arrested immediately, prosecuted criminally, and would face the full consequences of her actions. The woman began to cry, not tears of genuine remorse, but of panic, as reality crashed down on her. Rick made a move to intervene, but the judge's glare silenced him before he could even open his mouth. The bailiff was given direct orders to take Amber into custody. She protested, screamed, tried to resist, but it was useless. Handcuffs were snapped onto her wrists as she shrieked for Rick, begging him to do something, to use his contacts to get her out of this. But Rick remained seated, motionless, his brain still processing the fact that he had indirectly assaulted a judge's daughter. He knew that any wrong move at this point could make his situation even worse, if that was even possible. Amber was dragged out of the courtroom, her screams echoing down the hallway until they faded into a distant murmur. Alone with Rick and his lawyer, Judge Miller turned his full attention to the mogul. Marcus Quinn tried one last gambit, asking that his client be allowed to leave, arguing that he had not directly committed any assault and could not be held responsible for Amber's actions. It was technically true, but everyone in that room knew that Rick was just as guilty as his mistress. He had created the hostile environment, he had encouraged the provocations, he had treated Clara as something disposable. The judge didn't respond to the lawyer. His eyes remained fixed on Rick. Then, with a calmness that was more menacing than any shout, the judge began to explain what would happen next. He had already contacted, through the proper channels, the Cook County State's Attorney's Office and the IRS. The documents on tax fraud, money laundering and corruption in public bids would be officially forwarded to the competent authorities. Rick would face criminal investigations on multiple fronts. His bank accounts, both domestic and international, would be frozen preventively to ensure restitution to the public treasury. His properties and companies would undergo rigorous audits. Every cent obtained illegally would be traced and confiscated. Rick finally found his voice, but it came out trembling, stripped of its former arrogance. He tried to negotiate, offered to compensate Clara generously, said he would give her half of everything he owned if that folder wasn't sent to the authorities. He promised to acknowledge paternity, pay lifelong support, do whatever was necessary. But the judge shook his head. It wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about justice. It was about a man who had used his power and influence to destroy lives, to corrupt institutions, to place his interests above the law and basic morality. And it was about a father who, though he was late, would not allow his daughter to be another victim of a corrupt system. The judge made it clear that Clara would indeed receive what was rightfully hers. Half of the couple's assets would be divided as provided by law, and child support would be set at an amount consistent with the standard of living she had during the marriage. But that would not save Rick from the criminal consequences of his actions. The tax fraud, the corruption, the money laundering, all of it would be investigated and punished. He would not escape simply by paying what he owed Clara. The price for his crimes would be much higher. Marcus Quinn, experienced enough to know when a battle was lost, stood up and announced his withdrawal from the case. He could no longer represent Rick under the revealed circumstances. It was a calculated desertion, a way to protect his own professional reputation. Rick was left alone, without a lawyer, without allies, facing a judge who held all the cards and had no reason to be merciful. The mogul sank into his chair, defeated, feeling completely powerless for the first time in his life. The hearing was concluded with a severe court order. Rick was forbidden from approaching Clara, from contacting her directly or through third parties, under penalty of immediate arrest. His accounts were frozen that very instant, through orders issued electronically to financial institutions. His assets were placed under judicial lien until the division was completed, and a criminal case was formally initiated based on all the evidence collected over the years by the judge. Rick left the courtroom not as the untouchable tycoon who had entered, but as a broken man, facing the real possibility of losing everything he had built. Meanwhile, at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, Clara was being examined by an emergency medical team. The doctors worked efficiently, checking the baby's vital signs, performing an ultrasound to assess for any potential damage. Clara was in a state of shock, trembling uncontrollably, unable to process everything that had happened. A nurse held her hand, trying to calm her, telling her they would do everything possible to ensure she and the baby were fine. But Clara barely heard her. Her mind was trapped in that horrible moment when she felt the impact of the kick, in that instant of pure terror when she thought she would lose her child. Hours passed in a haze of tests, medical questions, and suffocating anxiety. Finally, the attending obstetrician appeared with a relieved expression. The baby was fine. The heartbeat was normal. There were no signs of placental abruption or fetal distress. Clara had been very lucky. The kick had been violent, but the angle and the natural protection of the amniotic fluid had minimized the impact. She would need to be kept under observation for a few hours and be on absolute bed rest for the next few days, but both she and the baby would survive without lasting harm. Clara broke down in tears of relief, clutching her belly and thanking God for protecting her child. It was at that moment that the door to her room opened, and Judge Miller walked. And he was no longer wearing his black robe. He wore a simple dark grey suit and carried an expression of deep concern. Clara recognized him immediately as the judge from the hearing, but she didn't understand why he was there, at the hospital, visiting her personally. He approached the bed slowly, as if afraid of startling her, and asked in a gentle voice how she was feeling. Clara replied that she was okay, that the baby was okay, and thanked him for helping when Amber attacked her. The judge pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed. He was silent for a long moment, as if gathering the courage to say something extremely difficult. Then, his voice thick with emotion, he began to tell the story he had revealed in the courtroom. He spoke of Teresa, of the youthful love he had destroyed out of cowardice. He spoke of the pregnancy he learned about too late, of the daughter he had watched from afar but never had the courage to meet. And finally, looking into Clara's eyes, he said that she was that daughter, that he was her biological father. Clara was paralyzed. Her mind simply couldn't process the information. Her whole life, her mother had only said that her father couldn't be present, never going into detail, always gently deflecting the subject. Clara grew up without missing a father figure because Teresa had been both mother and father, giving her all the love and structure she needed. But now before her was a man claiming to be her father, a respected, powerful judge who could have been present but chose not to be. Clara's first reaction was anger, a deep, painful anger that came from a place she didn't even know existed. She asked why, if he knew about her all those years. He never approached her, never tried to get to know her, never gave her the chance to have a father. Why did she have to grow up answering awkward questions from classmates about where her dad was? Why did she have to make up excuses, create stories, deal with the feeling of abandonment even as her mother did everything to compensate? The judge didn't try to defend himself. He simply told the truth, that he was a coward, that he prioritized his career and social standing over love and responsibility, that it was the worst decision he had ever made, and that not a day went by that he didn't regret it. He explained that Teresa had made it clear she didn't want him around, that she would raise her daughter alone with dignity, and he, respecting her wish but consumed by guilt, ensured that Clara had access to everything she needed financially, always anonymously. It was no excuse, he admitted. Money never replaces presence, never replaces a real father. But it was all he allowed himself to do, because he didn't feel he deserved any more than that. Clara listened with tears streaming down her face, feeling a confusing mix of anger, sadness, and a strange relief at finally knowing the truth. Teresa Miller had passed away 2 years earlier, a victim of a cancer that had progressed rapidly. Clara had been by her side until the end, holding her hand, thanking her for everything her mother had done for her. Teresa never revealed who Clara's father was, taking that secret to her grave. Now, looking at Judge Miller, Clara wondered if her mother had known he was watching over their lives from a distance, if she knew about the scholarships, about the anonymous financial help. If she had somehow forgiven the man who had abandoned her while pregnant. The judge took a deep breath and confessed that Teresa had known, yes, about everything. A few months before she passed, when she was already very ill and knew she didn't have much time left, she had sought him out. It was the first time they had seen each other in nearly 30 years. Teresa told him she was dying and needed to make peace with the past. She said she had never hated him, that she understood the pressures he had been under, that she had raised Clara alone, not out of spite, but because she wanted to prove to herself that she could. She thanked him for the discreet financial help over the years, said she had always known it came from him and had accepted it because it was for her daughter's good, not for her own. Teresa made only one request in that final meeting. She asked that, after she was gone, he would look after Clara, not necessarily by taking on the role of a father, because he had lost that role long ago, but by protecting her from a distance, as he had always done. And if Clara ever needed him, if life became too difficult, that he would be there, that he would not fail again. The judge promised with tears in his eyes that he would honor her request, and that was why he had followed Clara's marriage to Rick so closely. That was why he had investigated the mogul so meticulously, and that was why, When he saw his daughter being assaulted in that courtroom, he didn't hesitate to break every protocol to protect her. Clara listened to it all with a heavy heart. To imagine her mother, sick and frail, making peace with the man who had abandoned her, asking him to take care of their daughter, was deeply moving. Teresa had always been a woman of extraordinary strength, but also of a generous heart, capable of forgiving even the deepest wounds. Clara realized that holding on to anger against the judge would be to dishonor her mother's memory. Teresa had forgiven him, and if she had forgiven him, Clara had to try too. In a voice still trembling but calmer, Clara asked what would happen now. The judge explained the entire legal situation. Amber was in jail and would face criminal charges for aggravated battery. She was unlikely to get out any time soon, and when she did, she would have a record that would follow her for the rest of her life. Rick, for his part, was completely ruined. The investigations into his fraud had already begun. His accounts were frozen, his assets under judicial lien. He would lose everything, not just because of the divorce, but because of the crimes he had committed over the years. The child support and division of assets would be just the beginning of his problems. Clara felt no satisfaction at this news. Despite everything Rick had done to her, she wasn't driven by revenge. She was just tired, exhausted from the whole battle. All she wanted was peace to raise her child, rebuild her life, and move on. The judge understood this feeling perfectly. He gently took her hand and said that she would never have to face this alone again, that he would be there if she would let him, not as a perfect father figure, because he wasn't, but as someone who genuinely cared and would do everything in his power to ensure that she and the baby had a dignified and happy life. Clara looked at this man, saw the sincerity in his eyes, saw the regret and the genuine desire to make things right, even if it was late. And she decided to give him a chance. It wouldn't be easy. Building a relationship after so many years of absence never is. But she was willing to try. For her mother, who had asked for this. For her son, who deserved to know his grandfather. And for herself, who had always missed having a father, even if she never admitted it out loud. The following days were a whirlwind of events. Clara was discharged from the hospital with strict doctor's orders for bed rest. Judge Miller arranged for her to be set up in a comfortable and secure apartment in Lincoln Park, one of Chicago's best neighborhoods, with all expenses paid. It wasn't charity, he explained. It was the least a father should do for his daughter. Clara accepted, knowing she needed to prioritize the baby's health over her own pride. Rick tried to contact her several times, from different phone numbers, sending desperate messages asking to talk, to negotiate, offering everything. He had if she would drop the complaints and convince the judge not to proceed with the criminal investigations. Clara blocked every number, following the advice of the new renowned lawyer now representing her, a professional recommended by the judge himself, who was working the case pro bono. There was nothing left to negotiate. Rick had made his choices and would now face the consequences. Amber, from jail, also tried to send messages through mutual acquaintances, saying she was sorry, that she had only acted that way out of jealousy, that she didn't deserve to be in prison. But Clara didn't respond. The truth was, she didn't feel anger toward either Amber or Rick. She only felt a deep sadness for how things had unfolded, and an immense exhaustion from the whole situation. She preferred to focus on the future, on the baby about to be born, on the new relationship she was building with her father. The weeks passed, and Clara entered her 9th month of pregnancy. Judge Miller visited her regularly, always with gifts for the baby, always asking how she was feeling, always available for any need. They talked about life, about Teresa, about regrets and second chances. Slowly, a relationship began to form. It wasn't perfect, there were still unresolved hurts, moments of awkwardness, but it was genuine, and for Clara, that was enough. 1 month after the fateful hearing, Clara went into labor. It was a night of anxiety and pain, but also of hope. Judge Miller was in the hospital waiting room, pacing back and forth, as nervous as any first-time grandfather. When the doctor finally came out of the delivery room to announce that everything had gone well, that mother and baby were healthy, he felt an emotion he hadn't experienced in decades. He cried right there, not caring who might see him, letting the tears of relief and happiness flow freely. Clara held a beautiful baby boy in her arms with dark eyes and black hair, who was crying with a strength that showed off his healthy lungs. When the judge entered the room and saw his daughter with his grandson, he felt that he was finally doing something right. Clara looked at him, and for the first time since learning the truth, smiled a genuine smile. She offered him the baby to hold and, in an emotional voice, said that she had decided to name her son Henry, in honor of his grandfather. It wasn't complete forgiveness, it didn't erase the years of absence, but it was a gesture of reconciliation, a bridge being built between the past and the future. The judge held his grandson with trembling hands, looking at that tiny, perfect face. He promised silently that he would be the grandfather to this boy, that he should have been a father to Clara, that he would not fail again, that he would protect this family with everything he had. And for the first time in a long time, he felt his life had a purpose greater than court rulings and bureaucratic processes. He had a family. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Richard Sterling was facing his new reality. His companies had been audited, and irregularities were found in almost every operation. He was facing multiple criminal charges for tax fraud, money laundering, corruption, and racketeering. His lawyers, the best money could buy, worked day and night trying to minimize the damage, but the situation was practically irreversible. His accounts remained frozen, his properties were being auctioned off to pay debts to the IRS, and his reputation was completely destroyed. Rick lost not only his money and material possessions, but also all the friends and contacts he thought he had. Politicians who once frequented his parties now refused to take his calls, fearing association with someone under criminal investigation. Businessmen who had deals with him cancelled contracts and partnerships, protecting their own reputations. He was completely isolated, facing the consequences of years of corruption and arrogance alone. Amber, for her part, was convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison for aggravated battery. She would serve her time in a state penitentiary with no chance of parole in the early months. Inside the women's prison, far from the luxuries and comfortable life she had led with Rick, she finally had time to reflect on her choices. But when remorse came, it was too late to change anything. 6 months after little Henry's birth, the divorce was finalized. Clara received half of the assets that remained after the judicial freezes and confiscations for tax crimes, which was still a significant amount. Child support was set at a generous level, ensuring the boy would have material comfort throughout his childhood. Rick, present at the final hearing, signed all the documents with a defeated expression. He looked at Clara one last time, perhaps hoping to see anger or satisfaction in her eyes, but he saw only indifference. She had already moved on, had already built a new life, and he was just a bad chapter she preferred to forget. Clara resumed her career as an architect, now working on social urbanization projects, using her talent to improve the lives of underserved communities. It was work that gave her far more satisfaction than the commercial projects she used to do. Judge Miller supported her in everything, proud to see his daughter, using her skills to make a difference in the world. He became a devoted grandfather, visiting Clara and little Henry whenever his schedule allowed, bringing gifts, telling stories, creating memories that compensated, at least partially, for the lost time. On a sunny Saturday afternoon, Clara was in Lincoln Park with her son in her lap and the judge by her side. They watched other families playing, children running, couples strolling. It was a common, everyday scene, but for them it held a special meaning. It represented normalcy, peace, a life rebuilt after the storm. Little Henry babbled happily, trying to reach the leaves of a nearby tree, and Clara smiled, watching her son's innocent joy. The judge looked at her and asked if she was happy. Clara thought for a moment before answering. Happiness wasn't the absence of problems or pain, she had learned. It was the ability to find joy despite them, to build something beautiful even on ruins. She looked at her son, at her father beside her, at the life she was rebuilding brick by brick, and she answered with sincerity that yes, she was happy. Not in the way she had imagined when she married Rick, full of luxury and appearances, but in a deeper, more real, more true way. The judge smiled, relieved. He too was finding a happiness he had never known before. His career had always been brilliant, his rulings respected, his name admired in legal circles. But all of that seemed empty compared to the simple pleasure of being with his daughter and grandson, of being part of a family, of having a purpose beyond the professional. He realized he had spent his entire life prioritizing the wrong things, putting career and status above relationships and love. But it wasn't too late to change. It never was. Months turned into years. Little Henry grew up strong and healthy, a cheerful and curious child who charmed everyone around him. Clara thrived in her career, gaining recognition for her innovative social architecture projects. Judge Miller, now nearing mandatory retirement, planned to dedicate his final years on the bench to causes related to protecting vulnerable families, influenced by his own experience. Rick was serving his sentence in a halfway house after being convicted of multiple financial crimes, working community service jobs, and trying to minimally rebuild his life. Amber had been released after serving her. A sentence, but lived a quiet, anonymous life, far from the spotlight she had once loved. The story that had begun so painfully in that suffocating courtroom had transformed into something unexpected. It wasn't a perfect fairy tale ending, because real life never is. There were still scars, difficult memories, moments of pain when recalling all that had happened, but there was also healing, growth, second chances, and the proof that even from the darkest situations, something luminous can be born. Clara had learned that strength isn't about never falling, but about getting up as many times as necessary. She had learned that family isn't just blood ties or constant presence, but also choice, effort, and commitment. She had learned that true love isn't the kind from idealized romances, but the kind that remains even when all seems lost, that rebuilds itself on ruins, that forgives without forgetting, that grows despite adversity. Judge Miller had learned that it's never too late to do the right thing, that genuine regret is accompanied by action, not just words. He had learned that a true legacy isn't judicial rulings or professional recognition, but the positive impact we leave on the lives of those we love. He had learned that being a father is much more than biology or physical presence. It's being emotionally available, protecting without smothering, guiding without controlling. And little Henry, innocent of all the pain that preceded his birth, grew up surrounded by love, protection, and examples of resilience. He would be raised with the full story, knowing the hardships his mother faced, the complex role his grandfather played, and the wrong choices his biological father made. He would be raised with solid values, with an understanding that people are complex, capable of both terrible failings and surprising redemptions.